Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Welcome and welcome back to everyone joining us on Rooted to Thrive, conversations that elevate our humanity podcast. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, aka Professor P. And today we have the founder and principal consultant of Shift Ed Consulting, Vanity Jenkins. Vanity is a DEI strategist and an executive coach, particularly supporting women of color. And Vanity has a rich background, former educator, school administrator, and now, listen, y'all, she is living out her vision to abolish racism and anti-Blackness from organizations across America. Okay? Now, listen, I met Vanity about 2 years ago at the Critical Race Studies in Education Association conference in Chicago. Now, although both of us live in different states, other than Illinois, we meet there, but we were immediately connected as educators with businesses focused on eradicating racism and other forms of oppression. And then we find out that we're connected through someone I went to high school with in Brooklyn. Such a small world. Vanity, it is my honor to have a conversation with you today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for that beautiful welcome. And excited to dive into this conversation with you. I know you do a lot of similar work
Yes.
with organizations and in healthcare and specifically. So honored to be here and excited for the conversation.
That's right. It's going to take a village of organizations,
Absolutely.
of businesses, of people to get the results we want in this world, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, yes. So I say that there's always enough to go around, and we're just going to keep doing this thing. I think when you're committed to the justice, there
Mhm.
is no holding back,
Right.
right? Get those voices heard out there.
Right.
And so that's exactly what we're doing. Well,
Right. Right.
yeah, so today we're talking about equity. No power, no point. How equity without power is performance. Why DEI is being erased and what we can do about it. So, Vanity, just to get started, can you share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this work?
Sure. A lot of the work that I do is really actually connected to my childhood. So
Mm,
I was born in South Carolina, and when I was three, my parents and I moved to Iowa City. So went from being primarily surrounded by people who looked like me, family, etc., to being in a very, very white space. My dad was pursuing his MFA at the time at the University of Iowa. And so, we all packed up and we moved there. And it was a very jarring experience, even though I was three or four. My parents did a lot of very intentional things to make sure that I still grew up with a proud sense of being Black. So I wasn't allowed to watch white princess movies. If
mm,
someone sent me a shirt with a white character on it, we had to color it. Um,
mm.
Favorite movie at the time was Dreadlocks and the Three Bears. I used to listen to Shake It to the West and Shake It to the East, which was just songs, African
Mhm.
based spiritual songs. I had a book called JAFTA, and it was about a boy from Kenya. So they just made really intentional choices to make sure that I still was surrounded by Blackness. And although they made those choices, right, racism is still present no matter where we are. So I had a number of different encounters in school and, out in public where racism was very, very blatant to me. Um, as I grew up, we moved to Connecticut when I was in second grade. And again, racism was just like boom, right in your face. I remember my dad is very, very light skinned. He's lighter than me. And my mom is dark skinned. And so we were looking for a home in Connecticut. And my dad was like, this is the one. It's great. I'm so excited. So he came to the car to get me and my mom so that we could also see it. And as soon as we stepped out of the car, the woman was like, I have to show the house to someone else. I know we talked about you going ahead and renting it, but I have to show it to someone else. I have people here tomorrow. And so we knew what happened. She assumed my dad was white. And once she saw me and my mom, instantly changed her mind. And so, again, that's just another very blatant experience with racism. And then one more that really catapulted me into education specifically, when my brother went to private school K2. So in third grade, he went to public school. And I remember my parents got a letter saying that he would be moved to a special education classroom starting on Monday. And so my parents were shocked. And they ended up going to the school asking to see what tests they had given my brother. Why hadn't they been contacted throughout the testing process? They had all of these questions. And they also brought his scores from his private school where he was in the top 1% in both ELA and math. And so, the school was very apologetic and said there was some sort of mistake and that he would stay in his classroom. And my parents talked to us about what happened. And had my parents not have known how to navigate the education system, my brother's life trajectory would have been very, very different. From being in a self-contained classroom versus being in a general education classroom. And the reality was he was very hyper. He was hyper. He probably had ADHD and he was bored in class. So I'm sure he was cutting up, right? I'm not saying that, it came out of nowhere, but there was no academic basis for the letter that they sent my parents. And choices like that, unfortunately, happen all the time in education. And so those experiences really shaped my own identity in terms of what does it mean to be a Black woman, a Black girl. What are the things that I have to advocate for, even as a child, for myself or for my brother or sister. And that advocacy just catapulted and stayed with me as I was an adult and as I became a teacher and then, eventually a DEI strategist. Even as an educator, I taught in the Mississippi Delta. And so I remember moving from New Jersey to Mississippi. People always knew Mississippi was, 50th in education. And I assumed when I got there that white folks would be in charge. And that's why Mississippi was so behind. And I got there and found a very different story. I taught in Quitman County, Mississippi, which was where Dr. King started the Poor People's Campaign. It was the poorest county when he started the Poor People's Campaign and was still the poorest county in the country when I was teaching there. And so, you're talking about generational poverty, generational trauma. And I had to really, really learn what it meant to be in community with people, to learn how to work with people, to not bring all of my assumptions into the classroom. And really, we thought a lot about restorative justice at that school in particular. And I led a couple of initiatives there, which really, really catapulted me into the work that I do now in terms of DEI.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. And, there are so many common threads in our lives, but, well, I would say common, parallel. Had a
Mm-hmm.
brother, same situation where he was identified. However, my family did not have the tools to advocate in the same way. And it may have been, I don't know this for sure, we didn't talk about it, but it may have been what I see a lot today, where
Yep.
people are just taking what the school says.
Yep. Yep.
What I know, right, as I studied sociology undergrad, right, then I began to understand better that, hey, my brother is really artistic, like artist,
Mm-hmm.
and schools were not made for
Yep.
that child, not our
Yep.
public schools, even
Yep.
back then, right? So yeah, I had the benefit of having the arts and but we're only about 7 years apart. And by the time he was in school, they were really getting rid of the
Yep.
arts, right? And
Yep.
really honoring it. So when it's absent, it's clear that
Yep.
it's not considered important,
Yep. Yep.
right?
Brother and
And
I are 6 years apart, so just another
6,
parallel.
okay, look at that. Look at that. Now, I did not have as many experiences with blatant racism. However, what you just shared about the renters experience was just on a show the other day. And if it's on media today, it's still happening.
Yep. Yep.
It's still happening, right? That people are having that very experience that you described, that literally show up and then, so either they hear your voice and think that you're white
Yep. Yep.
and you show up and then suddenly it's rented.
Yep. Yep.
Very interesting dynamics, right?
Yep.
And I just say that to say for the people who don't believe or who think we've overcome,
Right.
this is why we
Right.
continue to
Right.
do the work that we do.
Right.
Okay. Well, listen, thinking about our shared mission, right? I thought about the Angela Davis quote that you had on your website, right?
Mm-hmm.
It says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is directly tied to a belief system and our dispositions in all spaces that we occupy. Can you
Yep.
expand upon why we need to act as if radical transformation is possible all the time and what that might look like?
Sure. I mean, I think we can just look around with what's happening right now with our current administration and the shifts that are being made with the federal government. One, chaos is the goal. Chaos is very disorienting. It makes you feel overwhelmed. It makes you feel like change is impossible. And so, as much as we are being surrounded by chaos in this current moment, we have to remember that things can change, that things have always changed, and that people have always led initiatives for liberation, for freedom, et cetera. One of the things that I have been really trying to remind people and ground people in this current context is that while this seems jarring and so far fetched, we have had other presidents who have come in and done very similar things, whether it was Reagan or Nixon. This isn't out of the blue per se.
Mhm.
Now it is harmful, right? And lots of people are being harmed and will continue to be harmed. But I like to ground us in context and think about the people who led the movements during those administrations, right? There's already a blueprint for how we can combat some of the things that are happening. And so, really being a historian to a degree and really learning
Mhm.
about how people made changes and shifts during those administrations is something that I think is important. And so, with that Angela Davis quote, dreaming is something that is so freeing and something that can be very challenging if you are constantly oppressed and overwhelmed, right? You don't even have the time to dream because you're stuck in survival mode. And
Yes.
so I think people have to intentionally take time and think about, what could this look like? What could a different world look like? I remember I just had a conversation the other day with my daughter, and I said, if there were no rules in the world, how would you design the world, right? And one of the things she said is money wouldn't exist. You wouldn't have to buy anything. People would just be able to live in homes, to go get their groceries, essentially having their basic needs met, which is something that could actually be a policy shift, right? And so
Mhm.
before you can make the shifts, you have to dream and think about what can be possible, what is different from the current situation, so that you can have an idea of where you're trying to go. For some tactical or tangible strategies, I think people leading teams and organizations right now really need to be thinking about not only their mental health and their capacity, but also the capacity of people on their team and how the current chaos is impacting different people, right? And so there are so many ways that people might be impacted, whether it's caregivers who are worried about Medicaid and Medicare, right? Whether it is people who have family who are worried about being deported, whether it's people who have family members or relatives who have lost their jobs because they worked with the federal government, right? There are just so many ways that an individual employee might be carrying additional baggage with them to work. And so, really being intentional about how you all are going to move forward in this moment, being very clear about strategy. And I think we need more people to double down on their commitments. I think we saw in the first month so many organizations just complying and getting rid of DEI or putting things on the table that they had been working for a long time. And that also is disorienting and hard for people, right? If I am in an organization and I've been working there and you all have been telling me that equity is important, that dismantling racism is important, and now I hear the message drastically shift, that's going to be a very disorienting moment for me that is going to impact the way that I show up for work. And we don't have to, right? I think another thing is people are conflating executive orders with laws, and executive orders are not laws. So you can also say no, right? Like your organization can say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to take a different direction. And unfortunately, I haven't seen as many people do that, especially larger organizations. A lot of people who I know who are small businesses are kind of doubling down, which potentially is more risky for a small business than it is for a huge corporation or a huge nonprofit. And I think we need to see more organizational leaders stand up and say no and, push for changes to happen instead of complying.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, I wanted to share something that I actually learned from, my own professional development. Went to a session led by an attorney, and one of the things that she shared was that some of the private corporations are responding to shareholder activism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's a very real thing for
Yep.
them. There are companies like Comcast that are regulated by the FCC,
Yep.
and everything they do will be, um, I guess, it will be potentially interrogated, investigated
Under the
by the
microscope.
federal
Yep.
government, right? And
Yep.
so there is some higher level of risk there.
Mm-hmm.
However, what was recommended to all that I would share with everyone is that as long as we can connect what we are doing in our organizations to saving us money as a business,
Mm-hmm.
saving us money, making us money, or tied to our mission, right? Helping
Mm-hmm.
us maintain our mission, we should be okay.
Yep. Yep.
Right. And I
Yep.
understand it's jarring because people don't know what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
But I would say I have a feeling I know where you're coming from when you talk about how equity without power is performance
Mm-hmm.
because of some of the ways organizations have approached DEI,
Yep.
right? So why don't you talk to us a little bit about how equity without power is performance?
Sure. So I want to give just a little history because I think a lot of people miss this point, but DEI isn't something that just started in 2020. DEI started a lot earlier in the 80s and in some cases the 70s. And really it was to help companies ensure that they were following the law, right? So making sure that you were hiring veterans, that you were hiring women, et cetera, making sure that you're following the law. As early as 2010, the majority of chief diversity officers were actually white men. They were not people of color. They were not Black women. They were white men. And so for a long time, this field of DEI itself was performative. It was more of a check the box thing, make sure that I have a program for veterans, make sure that I have some employee resource groups or affinity groups, and make sure that I am thinking about quotas, right? That's what a lot of DEI work was. And in the 2000s and especially past 2010, that's when you started seeing more people with a critical race theory background entering the field of DEI and wanting to make larger, significant changes. And I think that is what people are pushing back on, because people were asked to really interrogate race and racism, asked to make systemic changes within the organization, asked to interrogate their data, et cetera. And so when I say DEI work without power is just performative, what I really am trying to get at is that if you are not systematically making organizational wide shifts with your DEI policies, you're not really doing DEI work, right? And so quality DEI work is not, okay, we had we celebrated Black History Month or we celebrated Women's History Month, right? Quality DEI work gets to the experiences that women are actually having at work. Are women being promoted at the same rates as men? Are women being hired at the same rates as men? Are women being hired only in entry level positions where men are being hired, at more senior positions? What does your leadership team look like? What does your board look like? Does it reflect the staff? Does it reflect the community that you're working in? And beyond hiring, what is the experience that people are having? So one of the things that I always tell organizations, when you collect staff data, you have to cut it by as many demographics as you have. So of course, cut it by race, cut it by gender, cut it by LGBTQIA plus status, cut it by ability, cut it by all of these different markers that really impact how people experience the workplace. Think about accessibility. Can anyone enter your office? Do you have chairs that allow people with different body sizes to feel comfortable in those chairs? Do you have the things that people are going to need in order to be successful and to thrive in your environment? All of that is connected to DEI. All of those things are things that can be changed or shifted very easily. Another very easy shift, right? So many organizations have the title chief people officer or chief program officer without really interrogating where that word comes from. And to Indigenous communities, it is actually very harmful because their chief title had nothing to do with capitalism, right? Had nothing to do with being in this quote unquote position of power. So that is an easy change or shift that organizations can make. And so DEI work requires the power to make systemic changes within your organization. You should feel a change and a shift in the culture at the organization if you are doing DEI work with fidelity.
With fidelity, yes, indeed. And you have mentioned the fact that you know why it's being erased.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about why, such work with fidelity to give to that focuses on having a wide range of people in your organization, always feeling safe, psychologically safe, being able to thrive. Why is that, which is
Mm-hmm.
DEI, being erased?
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of something President Reagan said when he got into office, which essentially was, we made too many changes too fast, talking about the President Johnson administration, right? And when you think about what Johnson did, he did make some changes and shifts, but most of them weren't even implemented under his term. And so I think a lot about that in terms of what we're seeing in DEI. And I think there are two main things that got us to the point that we are in. I actually facilitated a session about white backlash to a group of funders because it is as predictable as the sun coming up the next morning, right? Whenever there is Black progress or perceived Black progress, there is white backlash, and the backlash historically has been very violent. We're seeing it now in a different way. We're not seeing people necessarily burn down Black towns, but we are seeing the very fabric of Blackness being attacked by this current administration. And so, one, the election of President Obama has contributed to this backlash that we are seeing. And two, the response to the George Floyd protests in 2020. And so, we were all at home because of COVID, which is
Mm-hmm.
I would hypothesize, which is one of the reasons why the George Floyd case in particular became such a huge cultural moment and such a huge protest. And it was a time I saw so many crazy things along with some really great things, right? Like I remember there was a video of white people washing Black people's feet in North Carolina. And there were just all of these things that folks were doing. Book clubs were popping up, and everybody was saying, we need to talk about racism. We need to talk about racism. And we are just 5 years out, and we can't even say race or racism anymore, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
because so much money was committed to racial justice, we're facing backlash because of that perceived progress. And I say perceived because most organizations never got the money. So yes, all of this money was committed, but it was never actually given to do the work that companies said they wanted to do, allegedly, right? And so now we are facing this backlash where people are questioning the very fabric of Black people's legitimacy in the workplace broadly, right?
Mm-hmm.
From the removal of the Jackie Robinson picture and other generals from the federal government, people are literally questioning our validity to do anything other than serve.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is an interesting time. And while it might not have shown up that directly at the organizational level, what I did see happening in organizations, which again is very predictable, is that backlash always comes, right? And so one of the things that I often do with organizations that I'm working with is when we are in our honeymoon phase and everybody is like, oh, Vanity, this is so great. We're going to grow so much. I give them a couple of scenarios. And so I say, I want you to draft a response to what you would say to a board member who tells you to end your DEI work. I want you to draft a response to somebody on the leadership team who is crying and says that this work is so harmful. What would you say? And I give them just a couple of scenarios so that when we're in that honeymoon phase, I can get their best thinking while they're still like, yes, DEI, because inevitably it always happens, right? A staff member pushes back, a board member pushes back. And I want them to remember how they said they wanted to respond. So in that moment, it's not a state of panic, because
Right.
often when somebody pushes back or says that something is harmful or causing them pain, people panic.
Mm-hmm.
And DEI work is not about keeping people happy, right? It is about making strategic changes to ensure that everyone has equitable access to success at your organization. And so I want people to think about that on the front end while they love me and while they love the work that we're doing, so that when we get to that moment, because it is inevitable, just like
Mm-hmm.
the white backlash that I was talking about at more of a macro level, it's still very predictable at the organizational level. And so we have to become comfortable with dealing with disequilibrium, or with people having different opinions, or with people not being happy. Racism isn't a happy thing to talk about, right? Even as a DEI strategist, when I talk about, or even the stories that I just shared with you about my childhood, those were not happy memories. They don't elicit joy when I think about them. And so people have to normalize the fact that DEI work is hard, and people are going to have feelings about that. And that is okay. It doesn't mean that you have to stop what you're doing because someone is having a hard feeling. Because as Black women, we know it's hard when we deal with it on a day-to-day basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is, when you're again talking about fairness or equity, it should not be on us to always have to deal with the implications of racism. Other
Mm-hmm.
people can share that in their own learning and making their own shifts about how they want to do things differently. And sometimes that is going to be hard, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad that you really described encounters with people and how you help them move and think ahead of time about how they may interact when they are challenged, right? Because these good feelings that we tend to have, I think that's why many efforts have stalled or move
Mm-hmm.
very slowly. It's because the people who have all the good intentions in the world
Yep.
are affected negatively by the jarring conflict, right? They
Mm-hmm.
almost can't even believe that some of their coworkers would challenge,
Mm-hmm.
what they believe in. Yes. And so that's what my work focuses on, the relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Focuses squarely on how we show up to maintain this this asset, right? The humans in our organizations. It is so critical. And the macro doesn't exist without the micro. It
Yep.
doesn't exist. Like it doesn't exist without us. We're
Yep.
literally bringing generations of harmful behaviors into our present, and people are not conscious of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
Absolutely. Yep.
You're right. It's so it's like there's that, and then there's the fact that people are just constantly coming up with different definitions of things that are inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
Someone just said to me the other day, well, people are upset with me because I'm a DEI hire. I was like, oops, stop.
Right.
Like let's stop right there.
Right.
There's no such thing.
Right. Right.
And what I hear when you're saying that is that there is this conflation with what was assumed the way affirmative action was
Right.
supposed to
Right.
work. And they've heard it in the sound bites, right? When you
Right.
hear the
Right.
president of the United States say, there's going to be no more DEI, everything is going to be merit based. That harkens to the time, right?
Right.
When there was the backlash to affirmative action.
Right.
What you just described is much beyond affirmative action. And yes, affirmative action was implemented inaccurately and on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
When people started, hiring, there were quotas put in place, and people were intentionally hiring people just to say, oh, I have a person of color here,
Right.
or
Right.
I have a person with disability. It was mostly a person of color at that
Right.
time, right? And they were doing that without considering qualifications, so they could say, see, they're not
Yep.
qualified, when there were tons of people who were.
Right. Right.
Yes. And we also forget that the way affirmative action is supposed to operate, it actually can benefit a male in a,
Yep.
female dominated profession,
Yep. I've
right?
seen it in education. Yep.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. In education, male nurses,
Yep.
there are many, the way these laws that were instituted were supposed to operate were not in practice. And I would dare say that's what we're doing
Yep.
today. That's what
Yep.
we're doing today. And that means people are implicated, right? How you approach diversity, equity, and inclusion work in general, really, you're implicated in that. So I really encourage people to understand the practice. And it's really a mindset
Yep.
shift, right?
Yep.
It's
Yep.
doing your work. If you're a policymaker, you're going to continue to create policy, but it's a mindset shift required for some,
Mm-hmm.
that requires you to consider those that you might not have, right? So supremacy culture tells us that you should think about the majority
Right.
instead of the one or two that are not in the majority,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's
Right.
what you're fighting against, right? And there's going to be a tendency to do that because you were trained to do that.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
Yes,
I
excellent, go ahead.
often I
Mhm.
tell people to think about it, and this comes from a framework. But when you think about racism, you have to think about it on the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional level, because it impacts
Mhm.
all of those levels.
That's
A
right.
lot of time people like to jump to institutional. And I've told organizations, I could write the most equitable policy book for you all. It could have, all of the check boxes. I can be really strategic about things that you should think about and things that you consider. But because people have to uphold the handbook, if the
Mhm.
people don't have an equity mindset, that equitable policy that I wrote on paper can still produce inequitable outcomes, because people are going to interpret it in the ways that, it makes sense to them. And people are going to make decisions that, if you don't have equity as your frame of reference or equity as your lens, you can turn anything into something that is problematic or something that is inequitable. And so you have to not only change the policies themselves, but you have to
Mhm.
change how people think and how people approach working with others in particular, and working with teams, because that is where we often see the most issues or the most problems inside of organizations, is at that interpersonal or at that team level, where you
That's
can
right.
see, well, Rochelle was able to take off 5 days, but I was only able to take off one. And maybe it's because you have a better relationship with Rochelle, or maybe it's because you have established trust with Rochelle, or it could be a number of reasons, right? But if we're not thinking about things from an equitable lens, what we know the data is going to say is
Mhm.
that Black women, 9 times out of 10, are going to have the worst experiences at work, because of the way our intersecting identities of being both Black and women impact us in this racialized system that we live in here in America.
Mhm. Yes, indeed. And so it has, it's overdue. We're overdue for change.
Yes.
We have to stay in that fight. The reason why people like you and I stay in it, we put our heads down and keep moving and don't get discouraged, is because of those that came before us in some
Yep.
ways, right? That people who came before us and did not put, they didn't see the America that we have today.
Right.
They didn't live long enough to see that. We see it today. So the America that we still are striving for, we will work for today without
Mm-hmm.
stopping,
Right. Right.
right? Yes. And that does come, I would dare say that, well, you might have a different origin story, but for me, it comes from seeing Black people, right, being in community
Mm-hmm.
and along with others, right? People from
Yep.
other racial groups. Actually, when we banded together across
Yep.
across income levels, across geography, we made change.
Yep.
And we still can do what is possible, even if we don't see it in our lifetime. But there
Yep.
are things that we can. When you mentioned the different levels, right? Individual, interpersonal, and the individual level is interpersonal.
Mm-hmm.
The institutional level of racism and other forms of oppression. What came to mind for me was the fact that when people do jump to the institution, they often remove themselves from having
Yes.
responsibility. It's like,
Yes.
well, the
Mm-hmm.
institution, well, who do you think is the institution?
Right.
Like, really,
Yep.
like, who do you think is the institution? And as much as people want to be leaders, they want to get promotions and so on and so forth, you are the institution,
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
right?
Yep.
So people make up these institutions. So all of us have a responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
right, to make the change that we want to see. And there
Yeah.
are many things that, we cover this on the podcast as well. Many things that we have to do to take care of ourselves, our wellness,
Absolutely. Yep.
because particularly in the Black community, we have literally been conditioned to be of service to others and leave ourselves out of the equation,
Yep. Yep.
and particularly Black women.
Yep, yep, yep. That is
Yeah.
what so much of my coaching is about,
Hmm.
with women of
Yes.
color and Black
Hmm.
women in particular, because Not only are we socialized to be of service at work, we're
Mm-hmm.
socialized to be of service in our families and
Mm-hmm.
in our communities. I'm also an eldest daughter. That comes with additional responsibilities, right? Of helping your siblings with different things that they're managing, helping your parents, helping sometimes your aunts, your cousins, your grandma, right? And so we are often stretched so thin that it has dire effects on our health, and dire effects on our ability to have clarity in terms of our mental health, or to be able to exercise, or eat the things that we want to eat. And so while we often are able to see the ways problems are happening at work because of our intersecting identities, and we often, people most proximate to the problem, I do believe, should be the ones coming up with the solutions. And we also have to find time to get that additional help and support that we need out, both in at work and outside of work, so that we can also take care of ourselves.
Yes, yes. And I encourage anyone who's in earshot of this podcast, call Vanity Jenkins, call Shifted Consulting. Am I saying that right? I
You
always want
are.
to say,
Mhm.
okay, good stuff. Because I was like, the ED is capitalized. I should say shifted. That's good stuff. Excellent. And so we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges, right? Um, and as people are going to move forward countering anti-Blackness, countering racism within organizations and within themselves. What can we do now about this movement to erase DEI?
hmm Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that we can do. One thing is to remember, not to try and just put it on your back and put on your superwoman cape and do everything by yourself. Um, Community is so important, and finding a community of people at work, in your personal life, etc., who are also grappling with these same questions and trying to push forward, I think is key. At work, I used to, when I was still working for an organization, and, it was before this current administration, but like lots of organizations, we had a lot of inequities, right? And so we would have our meetings after the meeting, and we would strategize who was going to say what at the next meeting, what were we asking for together. There was only one Black male on our team at the time, and so whenever one of the Black women would say something, he would immediately follow up and say, I agree, and add on to it. And so we really built ways to push our organization where we wanted to see it go, without any one person feeling like they had to be the sole, warrior for the team. But
Mhm,
we really
mhm,
split up and divided the work, and people use their proximity to power. So the Black male that I talked about was
mhm,
also on the leadership team. And so it was critical that he was following up with what we said. One, to elevate it, because we know women are often spoken over, but two, as a member of the leadership team, saying publicly, I agree with what Vanity saying, or this person is saying, really helped us make the changes and shifts that we needed to. Another thing that I think is important is, again, the dreaming. So thinking about, what would it be like if your organization was equitable? What would be different? How would you feel? What would be different about your time spent at work? What would you all be able to do better? A lot of times I think people forget that inequities cause poorer products, right? So whether you are a service-based organization, whether you are a product-based organization, if you don't have an equitable and inclusive culture, you're just not creating the best product. That's just a fact. And so really thinking thoughtfully about how you can create a psychologically safe, inclusive work environment, so that your
mhm,
work product is actually the best that it can be. So doing some dreaming about that, and sharing that with others, I think, is another thing that we can do. Um, and three, I would say we have to stop leading out of fear. I
mhm,
think the disorientation and the intentional chaos is causing a lot of people to be afraid, right? Again, that is
mhm,
the purpose of the chaos, is to incite fear. However, when we lead from a place of fear, we're not leading strategically. We're being very reactive. We are shooting ourselves in the foot, essentially. And so just remembering to pause, remembering that, executive orders are not laws,
Mhm.
checking in with your general counsel, understanding their comfortability with going to court if something, if that is an option of something that might happen depending on what you all are doing, really understanding that deeply. Some general counsels are like, I love being in the courtroom, I can argue this all day. And some are not, and so really understanding where their perspective is coming from. And ultimately I think that we need to get back to strategically leading our organizations. And this, I would say, since January, the number of organizations that I work with or have been in contact with who have kind of forgotten their strategic plans, who are forgetting their goals and their mission, and who are just kind of in this cycle of what do we do now? What do we do now with
Mhm.
the executive orders? It's just not, one is not healthy. Two, it's not productive, and it's certainly not strategic. And so remembering again, like you mentioned from that call with the lawyer, what is your
Mhm.
mission?
Mhm.
How is whatever you're doing going to make your work product the best that it can be? How's it going to generate money, right? And
Mhm.
staying focused on your strategic plan and accomplishing your work. In that way. And the last thing that I will say is there's always another method. I
Mhm.
think a lot of times we get stuck in scarcity mindset and we,
Mhm.
say we've always gotten our funding from the federal government. What are we going to do now? And while that may be a chat, like that's a real challenge, right? There are always other possibilities. There are more places where you can get money from. There are, donors and foundations who have
Mhm.
specifically said that they are stepping up in this time, given what the federal government is doing. And so thinking outside of the box and thinking,
Mhm.
again, strategically and fully about the options that are available to you.
Yes. And you brought up a very good point around thinking about outside of that box. So many smaller organizations have a great opportunity right now to
Mhm.
collaborate, to
Yes.
get under the umbrella of a larger organization
Yep.
and right and get funding. Uh, there are a number of organizations doing that here locally in Philadelphia already, thankfully.
Yes. That's
Not in
awesome.
reaction to the chaos, they were doing it before,
Right. Right.
right? That is such a smart way to work. I'm thinking,
Yep.
mainly of nonprofit organizations, but there are
Yep.
smaller for-profit businesses who could really leverage their community to
Yep.
get the same, if not more, resources than they've
Yep.
had before. It always takes, I mean, this is part of DEI, right? Thinking
Right.
about expanding your knowledge base by a diversity of people. And it doesn't have to be, or diversity of organizations, and it doesn't have to be similar organizations. In
Right.
fact, people innovate when you put things
Yes.
that don't seem to belong together, right?
Right.
Or you
Right.
put people in the same room and look, something gets created that didn't exist before.
Right. Right.
Yes, I know. It's just powerful. So your advice, I hope everyone takes it. And thinking about yourself, right? And what you can do. We are not, that's what I'm hearing you say. And I agree totally, right? That we are all impacted and implicated. We have
Yes.
responsibilities, we have rights.
Yep. Yep.
Uh, We have a human right to wellness.
Yes.
Yes. And we need to leverage our community to get some of what we have not gotten before,
Right. Right.
right? The answer is never, oh, you better not do that. You better watch out because you don't want it to fall back, come back on you. That's
Right.
never the answer. There is always a better answer.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Excellent. So is there any final advice or resources that you would recommend for those listening today, how they can help counter the anti DEI backlash, how they
Mhm,
can work for equity with power?
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Anything that you would like to share? Yeah.
Yeah, again, I would just reiterate um, that folks should really ground themselves in understanding that this is not out of the blue, right? This is as American as apple pie. We
Mm,
have had very racist presidents in the past who have followed a very, very similar playbook.
very.
I think one of the places that a lot of folks are stuck in is it hasn't happened in a lot of people's lifetimes, or people were a lot younger when it happened, so you might not have been working. You might have just been a student. And people are getting stuck again in that fear, and in a place of feeling like the world is caving in on you and you don't know what to do, right?
Mhm,
And so I
mhm,
would encourage people, when you are feeling like that, step away for a minute. Whether you meditate, whether you do deep breathing, whether you go out for a walk, but step
mm,
away.
mhm,
And when you come back, remember that this has happened before and people
mhm,
have always responded and fought back. This is
mhm,
not a time for us to roll over and, woe is me, this is the end. But this is a time for us to be really, really strategic, to learn how to use our community. I love what you shared about the nonprofits in Philadelphia, right? I remember being in undergrad and we had to do a kind of a culminating project where we had to do some sort of community service. And I remember saying to the professor, if people do this every year, why haven't we all just done something together that stays after we leave college, right? And so I've always had this mindset about the collective and what is
mhm,
possible with the collective. And
mhm,
so whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, maybe, a for-profit is sharing resources with a nonprofit, and resources don't always have to be money. It could
right.
be office space. It could be
Mhm,
sharing capacity of maybe your operational people or your folks in finance. There are so many ways that organizations can resource share. And then at the
mhm,
micro level, there's also ways that individuals can resource share, whether, that's donating to food pantries or community refrigerators, et cetera. But
mhm,
this is a time where we absolutely need community.
yeah,
And we need to both make sure that we are taking care of our individual selves, but also that we are taking care of those that we care about, both in our personal and professional lives. And so
mhm,
those are just some things that I would encourage people to do. Remember to stick to your strategy. Don't just throw
mhm,
it away because there is chaos coming. Remember that the chaos is intentional, and
mhm,
remember to prioritize your joy and your wellness. In terms of resources, I have a couple of free resources on my website. There's a strategic planning guide. There is a wellness workbook specifically for women of color. And so if those interest you, please feel free to download them. But just remember to take care of yourself and take care of each other. We are going to need each other to get through this, and not only get through it. I think to what you mentioned earlier, there's an opportunity for people and organizations to thrive in this moment if we can get out of the fear and get to the innovation.
that's right. That's right. And people have to, I just want to share this, that people have to really think about, why is fear something
Mm-hmm.
that we always go to?
Yep.
Now, why is it widespread, right? There are
Yep.
fewer of us talking about not having a spirit of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that really we can get through this. This is not pie in the sky,
Right.
right?
Right.
Think about, where is this spirit of fear in me coming from? And in
Yep.
some ways, it's because of the way our brains work. It wants to
Right.
protect you. It wants to go back to the pattern that it knows. I get that, but there is some conditioning happening there,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's some messaging that's happening, that long before we were conscious of these messages coming to us, that help perpetuate that sense of fear.
Yep.
And yes, and people who, I love the folks who are talking about propaganda or who have talked about propaganda. I want I want people to listen to them, those people as well,
Yep.
because that's what we're responding to.
Yep. Yep.
Yes, as usual.
Yep. Yep.
As usual, whether it was anti-blackness, anti-immigrant of any kind, at the
Mm-hmm.
time when the Irish were not
Yep.
considered white yet in
Yep.
America, right? No, no Irish need apply
Mm-hmm.
propaganda.
Yep. Yep. The
Yes,
scare, all of those things. Yep.
that's right. And so our power in some ways comes from not having fear.
Yep.
Yeah. Vanity, this has been a phenomenal call with you. This has been a great time. I could go on and on and on and on and talk with you for hours about this. I don't know if it is, do you have anything coming up this summer or fall that you want to share with folks? I
Yeah,
mean,
so I run a fellowship called Authentically Me for Women of Color. I'm the
yes.
co-founder of it, and we usually do it 2 or 3 times throughout the year. So again, just make sure that you are on my mailing list so you can find out information about that. We have the next one is coming up in April, and I'm not sure. We'll probably launch the third one in September. So just
Okay.
make sure that you're looking out for that.
All right. Fantastic. And how can people find you?
Yes, you can follow me at Shifted Consulting on Instagram and Facebook. And my website is shiftedconsulting.com. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, Vanity Jenkins. There are not a lot of vanity, so you should be able to find me pretty quickly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again and again. And I want to say thank you to everyone who stopped by and listened. It really is an honor to be able to say that we have, people helping us grow this platform. Please leave a comment, subscribe to this episode, share this episode, and thank you all again for listening to Rooted to Thrive.